Before you dive into this gripping tale, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let us know your initial thoughts in the comments below. Your support means the world. New York hummed with the usual chaos of the city that never sleeps. From the 48th floor of a sleek glass skyscraper, the skyline stretched endlessly in every direction. But inside the corner office of one of the city's most powerful CEOs, all was calm. Edward Blake sat behind a dark mahogany desk, his eyes fixed on the glowing screen of his laptop, his fingers dancing across the keyboard. His tailored suit was perfect, his expression unreadable, just as always. Nothing distracted him, not the breathtaking view, not the world beyond the glass. Certainly, not the quiet footsteps approaching him. Hazel stood in the doorway, holding something small and trembling in her hands. She was visibly nervous, but her voice didn't waver when she finally spoke. "I'm pregnant," she said. Edward paused for just a second, enough for the weight of her words to land in the air like a dropped glass. But instead of rising or looking at her, or even reacting like a man whose world had just shifted, he simply kept typing for another moment before leaning back in his chair. He met her gaze. His own eyes were quiet, perhaps too quiet. Brown, unreadable, calculating. "You know I don't want children," he said flatly. Hazel's hands tightened around the paper she'd been holding, her doctor's confirmation. She had expected the conversation to be difficult, but not this cold. She swallowed and took another step closer. "I'm not asking for anything. I just thought you should know." Edward closed the laptop slowly. His voice was calm, but every word cut like glass. "You have a choice, Hazel. The pregnancy and the baby. Or me." There was no emotion in his tone. No concern, no love, not even fear. Just a decision presented like a business deal. Hazel stared at him, her heart pounding, 1,000 thoughts swirling in her head. She could feel the walls of the room closing in. She waited for him to say he didn't mean it, to show something, anything, to prove he cared. But there was nothing, just silence and the same cold gaze. She nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if answering a question that had never really been a question. Then she turned and walked out. No tears, no words, no slamming door, just the sound of her footsteps, fading on the marble floor. Edward didn't rise. He didn't follow. The office remained as still as before. But outside, somewhere in the city, Hazel walked into a different future. One where she would face everything alone. One she hadn't chosen, but one she would make her own. What would you have done in Hazel's shoes? Share your thoughts in the comments. The first thing Hazel noticed about Portland was the rain. It wasn't the loud, stormy kind that fell in dramatic sheets. It was quiet and constant, a soft mist that seemed to settle on everything. Her coat, her shoes, her soul. She arrived with nothing but a suitcase, a worn sketchbook, and the folded ultrasound picture, which she kept tucked between the pages like a sacred bookmark. She hadn't told anyone in New York, no friends, no co-workers, no family. It was easier that way. No one to explain things to, no one to judge her for walking away from a man like Edward Blake. No one to make her second-guess the decision that she already felt, deep in her gut, was the right one. She found a one-bedroom apartment above a noisy coffee shop in a slightly run-down part of the city. The walls were thin, the heater rattled every time it kicked on, and the kitchen window didn't quite open all the way. But it was hers. Every creak of the chipped tile, every faint scent of espresso drifting up in the mornings. It reminded her that she had survived the fall and stood on her own 2 feet. She started working as a waitress at a nearby diner on the night shift, where tips barely covered rent and groceries, and the regulars liked to flirt with tired eyes and watery coffee in hand. But she didn't complain. She took the job without blinking, tied on her apron, and learned to smile through the ache in her feet and the dull exhaustion that never quite went away. During the day, she painted. Not because anyone asked her to or because she had commissions. She didn't at first, but because it was the only thing that made her feel like herself. She painted on anything she could find, scraps of canvas from thrift stores, old wooden panels, even the inside of cardboard boxes when money was tight. Her favorite subjects were always people, especially women and children, caught in fleeting moments of strength or vulnerability. She didn't always know what she was painting until she was done, but often the faces felt strangely familiar. One day, she realized she was painting herself, over and over again, disguised behind other lives. The pregnancy was hard. There were days she couldn't get out of bed with nausea, and others where the silence in her apartment felt unbearable. But Hazel grew stronger with each passing week. She went to doctor's appointments alone, rode buses across the city to get discounted prenatal vitamins, and taught herself everything she could about childbirth from library books. When her labor finally started on a rainy morning in early spring, she was already more prepared than she thought she'd ever be. She gave birth to a baby girl in a quiet hospital room, with no one to hold her hand. But the moment she looked into her daughter's eyes, dark brown and impossibly steady, something shifted within her. The pain, the loneliness, the years of doubt and fear faded under the weight of a tiny, perfect human being. She named her Lily. It was the name she'd whispered to her belly in the middle of the night, the name she'd painted in soft cursive behind one of her canvases, even before she knew if she was having a girl. Lily was born with dark brown hair, warm olive skin, and those unmistakable eyes, Edward's eyes. Hazel would sometimes look at her daughter for long stretches of time, wondering how someone so small could carry so much of someone she had left behind. But Lily was more than a reflection of the past. She was her own universe, curious, playful, and incredibly strong. By the time she could walk, she had already claimed every inch of their apartment, laughing, falling, and getting back up again, as if everything was a game. Hazel found new ways to make money. She started selling her art at local street fairs, beginning with small portraits for 20 each. People loved them, not because they were perfect, but because there was emotion in every stroke. She started getting requests, then referrals. Eventually, a small gallery asked her to display her work. It wasn't much, just a few paintings tucked into a corner during someone else's exhibition. But it was enough to make her believe she could build a real life here. She never contacted Edward. There were nights she lay awake, wondering if he thought of her, if he ever regretted the words he'd spoken so easily. But she never allowed herself to dwell on it for too long. Regret, she learned. It was a luxury you gave up when you chose to survive. What mattered now was Lily, her laugh, her small hands clutching Hazel's shirt as she fell asleep, her wild hair, and her questions about the stars. Hazel no longer felt the need to explain her choices to anyone. The child sleeping beside her every night was proof enough that she had chosen well. And in the quiet corners of her life, between the smell of coffee and paint, she started to feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. The air in Portland was crisp that morning, with the kind of early spring chill that hinted at rain, but hadn't quite committed. Edward Blake stepped out of the back seat of a sleek black car, adjusting the cuffs of his charcoal overcoat as he surveyed the unfamiliar street. He didn't particularly like Portland. Too quiet, too damp, too soft around the edges. But the city had recently emerged as a hub for independent tech startups, and one of them had caught his eye with a promising acquisition offer. Business, as always, took him to places he would otherwise never go. He had an hour to kill before his meeting. His assistant had suggested a nearby coffee shop, known for its strong espresso and artistic charm. Edward didn't care for charm. He needed caffeine and silence. As he walked down the sidewalk, his eyes scanning the storefronts, his gaze was involuntarily drawn to a small gallery tucked between a bookstore and a florist. The window display was simple. Several portraits on stretched canvas, unframed, each featuring a child's face caught in that soft, intimate light that made it feel like the subject might speak at any moment. One particular portrait made him stop. A little girl, no older than 3, with dark brown hair tucked behind her ear, her chin tilted slightly upward, as if looking at someone just out of frame. Her eyes were large and dark brown, warm, yet serious. Something about her expression rooted Edward to the sidewalk. He couldn't look away, though he didn't understand why. There was a tightness in his chest, a strange pressure he hadn't felt in years. The more he looked at her, the more unsettled he became. The signature in the corner caught his eye next. Hazel Moore. The name felt like a punch to his gut. He blinked once, twice, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something else. But they didn't. Hazel Moore. Her name hadn't crossed his mind in months, not because he'd forgotten her, but because it had been easier to pretend she'd never existed than to face what he'd done. Yet there it was, staring back at him, scrawled beneath a portrait that seemed to look into his soul. Something within him shifted. Without quite deciding, he pushed open the gallery door. Inside, the air was warmer, filled with the scent of oil paint, wood, and the faintest hint of citrus. The room was small, but thoughtfully arranged. Canvases covered the walls, children playing, mothers holding babies, women standing in the golden light of dusk. Each piece was filled with emotion, capturing the kind of beauty that made the viewer feel something long after they'd looked away. He walked slowly, taking in each piece, his mind spinning with questions he didn't know how to form. Then he heard a voice, light, musical, and utterly familiar. "I told you you have to hold my hand when we cross the street. Remember?" A little girl's giggle echoed behind it, and Edward instinctively turned towards the sound. She walked into the gallery from a side hallway, holding a small child's hand. Her posture was slightly stooped as she spoke to the girl. Her other arm held a small shopping bag. Her dark brown hair was pulled back in a loose bun, a few wisps falling around her face. She wore a paint-splattered sweatshirt, sneakers, and no makeup, but she looked more alive than he remembered. Hazel. He froze. She hadn't seen him yet. She was too focused on the child, whose curly brown hair bounced with every step. The little girl tugged on her arm, pointing to the portrait in the window. "Mummy, that's me," she said proudly. Hazel smiled, kneeling beside her. "Yes, it is. That was the first time you stayed still for more than 10 minutes. The little girl giggled and did a small twirl, the sound so bright it cut through the air. Edward felt the room tilt. He was still there, in the same spot, but the ground beneath him felt unsteady. Hazel finally looked up. The moment her eyes met his, everything inside him crumbled. For one long second, neither of them moved. Her green eyes, once filled with such trust and affection, now seemed wary, distant, unreadable. She rose slowly, placing a soft hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Lily," she said softly, "why don't you go look at the bird painting over there?" The little girl went without question, leaving them standing in the center of the gallery. Edward opened his mouth, but no words came out. Hazel didn't speak either. The silence between them stretched like a chasm, built on 3 years of everything unsaid. Finally, she broke it. "What are you doing here?" Her tone was not angry, but far from warm. She didn't move closer. If anything, she leaned back slightly, as if bracing herself. I didn't know," he managed to say, his voice rough. "I didn't know you were here. I didn't know about any of this." Hazel crossed her arms, watching him with that same unreadable gaze. "You didn't want to know. You made that clear." Edward winced. He had no defense. She was right. "She's mine," he said after a moment, the words barely audible. Hazel tilted her head, a tired half-smile pulling at one corner of her mouth. "She is mine," she corrected softly. "I carried her. I raised her. I held her when she was sick and taught her how to walk. I didn't ask you for anything, Edward, and I never will." He swallowed hard, shame rising in his throat. "Hazel, But she stopped him with a single look. Not cruel, just definitive. "I have to take her home." And with that, she turned. Hazel called Lily, took her hand, and the two of them walked out of the gallery as if he had never been there. He didn't follow. He couldn't move. He stood in the same spot for several more minutes, staring at the painting in the window as the rain finally began to fall outside. Only now did he understand what that pressure in his chest had been the moment he saw the little girl's face. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't shock. It was recognition. And he had never felt so empty in his life. Do you think Julian deserves a second chance? Or should Clara move on without him? Comment below with your thoughts. Edward didn't return to his hotel that night. He didn't answer any of his assistant's calls. He didn't reschedule the meeting he was supposed to have. And he didn't even notice the light rain soaking the shoulders of his coat as he stood. For over an hour, across the street from the gallery, staring at the door Hazel had disappeared through. Something inside him had shattered, not with a dramatic crack, but with a slow, quiet crumbling that started deep within him. The image of that little girl, Lily, had rooted itself in his mind, and no matter how hard he tried to focus, to reason, to regain his sense of control, it wouldn't leave him. Her eyes haunted him, not because they were beautiful or familiar, but because they were undeniably his. He finally returned to his hotel in the early hours of the morning, clothes damp, face haggard, and his usual sharpness dulled into something unfamiliar. He couldn't sleep. He sat in the darkness, staring at the skyline beyond the floor-to-ceiling window, wondering how he had managed to live for 3 years without realizing the magnitude of what he had discarded. Not just Hazel, though she had been more than he ever deserved, but the child, his daughter, a daughter, breathing, laughing, growing without him. Guilt hit him in waves, each one stronger than the last, pulling him under with memories of that final conversation in his office. The words he'd spoken came back with poisonous clarity. Either the baby or me. He'd said it like a question, but now he knew it had never been a question. It had been an order, and she had walked away. For 3 years, he had buried that moment under layers of work, success, and distraction. But now, it refused to stay buried. It replayed over and over in his mind, along with the image of Hazel, holding Lily's tiny hand, the way she had looked at him with a mix of exhaustion and quiet resolve. There was no hatred in her eyes, no bitterness. That was what made it worse. She had moved on. She had built a life. She had raised a daughter. And he hadn't even known. The next day, Edward returned to the gallery, but it was closed. A sign on the door indicated irregular hours. He waited again, sitting on a bench across the street, like a stranger, watching someone else's life unfold behind a glass wall. He wasn't sure what he hoped for. Perhaps for her to see him waiting and change her mind. Perhaps for her to feel something. But she never came. And for the first time in years, Edward didn't feel like a man with power or control or influence. He felt like a ghost. Later that week, he found himself walking through a small park near the river when he saw them again. Hazel was sitting on a bench beneath a tree, her sketchbook in her lap, while Lily played on the grass a few feet away, spinning in circles, singing to herself in a high, joyful voice. It was the kind of scene Edward had never imagined, never thought he'd want, but something about it pulled at him with an ache he couldn't name. He didn't approach. He didn't dare. Instead, he watched from a distance, hands in his pockets, jaw tight, feeling like a man watching the life he should have had, drift further away with each passing minute. Lily stumbled and fell in the grass, letting out a surprised yelp. Hazel was on her feet instantly, rushing to her side, brushing dirt from her dress, and kissing her forehead with practiced care. The tenderness of it ached in Edward's chest. He had no idea what Lily's first word had been. What she liked to eat, how she liked to be tucked in at night. He had missed it all. He had missed her entire beginning. When Hazel looked up, she saw him. This time she didn't look surprised, just tired. She rose slowly, said something to Lily. Then she started walking towards him. Her expression was unreadable, her steps measured. Lily clung to her hand, looking curiously at the tall man who stood as still as a stone beneath the tree. Hazel stopped a few feet away and said nothing at first. Edward didn't either. The silence stretched like a fragile thread between them until finally she spoke, her voice low and steady. "Are you following us?" He shook his head, not trusting his voice. "Then what do you want?" she asked. Edward looked at Lily, who was watching him with cautious fascination. And when he looked back at Hazel, he felt everything he couldn't say rise in his throat, like a wave too big to swallow. "I didn't know," he said. And though it wasn't enough, it was the only truth he had. He didn't know about her. Hazel's eyes narrowed slightly, not with anger, but with disbelief. "Why didn't you want to? I gave you a choice. You chose yourself." He didn't argue. There was no defense for what he'd done. "I want to fix it," he said, his voice cracking on the last word. "I want to know her, and I want to help." Hazel looked away for a moment, staring at the river, her jaw tight. When she looked back, there was pain in her eyes, not fresh, but the kind that had lived there for years and made itself a home. "It doesn't work like that," she said quietly. "You don't just show up and decide you're ready. She's not a project you can fix, or a meeting you can reschedule." "I know," he said. "I know. But please, I want to try." She studied him for a long moment, and then, without a word, she turned and walked away, her hand tightly intertwined with Lily's. Edward watched them go again, in the same way he had 3 years ago. This time, not by choice, but by consequence. And it was only then, standing alone in the park, that he truly began to understand what regret felt like. Not as an abstract idea, but as a weight, sharp and permanent, embedded deep in his chest. He had abandoned them once, and now he would spend every breath trying to find a way back. What do you think will happen next? Will Clara give Edward a chance, or is it too late? Let us know in the comments. In the weeks that followed, Edward's world shifted in quiet but irreversible ways. He returned to New York only briefly, just long enough to hand over his company's day-to-day operations to the deputy CEO, and inform the board he would be taking an extended leave. There were no questions he felt like answering. Business could run without him for a while, but what he had lost, what he might never get back, could not. For once, his absence in the boardroom didn't feel like a risk. The real risk, the one that consumed his every thought now, was letting Hazel and Lily walk away again, without doing everything in his power to be worthy of being near them. He returned to Portland not to interfere, but to be near. From a distance, he began to learn their routines, not in an invasive or obsessive way, but carefully and respectfully. He learned that Lily went to a local daycare 3 days a week, a modest place with chipped playground equipment and faded murals on the walls. He learned that Hazel still worked nights at the diner and spent her mornings painting, often walking with Lily to a nearby market afterward for groceries. He watched them from afar, not because he wanted to remain in the shadows, but because he hadn't yet earned the right to step out of them. Instead, he began to quietly mend what little he could. He contacted the daycare and made a private donation under an anonymous patron's name, enough to fix the broken play structures, update supplies, and secure scholarships for other struggling families like Hazel's. He found the landlord of the building where Hazel lived and paid 6 months' rent in advance, asking that the tenant never be told who had done it. He also contacted the owner of a small gallery in the Pearl District and recommended Hazel's work under a pseudonym, passing her portfolio along as if he'd stumbled upon it randomly. The gallery agreed to display 3 of her pieces in an upcoming show, and when she received the invitation, he imagined her confused, perhaps skeptical, but proud nonetheless. He didn't do any of this for recognition. In fact, the idea of Hazel knowing unsettled him. He wasn't trying to buy her forgiveness or force her trust. He knew that now. What he wanted was to make the path a little easier for her, even if she never let him walk beside her. But still, the yearning didn't fade. Every time he saw Lily's face, even in glimpses from across a street, something within him ached. She had a way of walking that reminded him of Hazel, head held high, feet steady, a gaze that met the world unapologetically. She was clearly intelligent and curious, fearless as children often are, and he was astonished by how much he had missed. Her first words, her first steps, the small victories and battles that come with growing up. There were nights he stayed awake, imagining what her laugh sounded like up close, how she hugged, what bedtime stories she liked best. All the things that had once seemed small now felt monumental. One rainy afternoon, Edward spotted Hazel and Lily in the back corner of a coffee shop bookstore. Lily was coloring at a table while Hazel browsed an art magazine, her fingers smudged with paint. Without thinking, Edward walked in and ordered a coffee, sitting 2 tables away, pretending to read the newspaper while stealing glances at them. When Lily dropped a crayon and it rolled under his chair, she scurried to retrieve it. As she stood up, she looked at him with those familiar brown eyes, wide with polite curiosity. "Hello?" she said. Edward froze for an instant. Then he smiled. "Hello." She didn't seem scared, just inquisitive. "That's a nice drawing," he added, nodding towards the paper in her hand. "It's a dragon," she explained, holding it up proudly. "But it's a good dragon. It doesn't eat people. It just protects castles." She felt seriously. "That's a very important job." She beamed at the compliment. Then she bounced back to Hazel, who had noticed the exchange and was now watching Edward with a wary expression. Their eyes met, and this time neither of them looked away. Hazel didn't smile. She didn't wave. But she didn't leave either. Later that day, Edward received an email. It was from Hazel. Just one line. "Stop following us. If you want to help, say so. Don't hide." He sat with her words for a long time. They were firm, but not cruel. Honest. Direct. He had crossed a line, and she had given him the choice to move forward or stay in the shadows where he'd been hiding. The next morning he replied to her, "I don't know how to ask to be a part of something I abandoned, but I want to be honest now. I want to know her, and I want to earn whatever chance I still have to know you. I will accept what you're willing to give me. No expectations, just honesty." He waited 3 days for her reply. When it came, it wasn't dramatic, just a time and a place, a park they had never visited together, a Saturday morning, no promises, no explanations, just an opening. Edward didn't overthink it. He didn't allow himself to hope. But he showed up, and for the first time in years, the space between them didn't feel like a wall. It felt like a door, barely ajar, and that was enough. The Saturday arrived with bright sunshine that felt out of place after days of cold drizzle. Edward had barely slept the night before. He rose early, dressed carefully but not overly formally, choosing a soft gray sweater and dark jeans that made him look less like the man who once wore tailored suits to breakfast meetings, and more like someone who belonged in a park on a spring morning. He wasn't sure what to expect. He only knew that Hazel had asked him to come, and that alone held more weight than any contract he'd ever signed. The park was quiet when he arrived, filled with the soft rustle of wind through the budding trees and the sounds of children's laughter in the distance. He spotted them almost immediately. Hazel was sitting on a bench beneath a willow tree, her back straight, her arms crossed in her lap. Lily played on the grass nearby, spinning in circles, her hair flying, utterly absorbed in her own little world of joy. Edward hesitated for a few seconds before approaching, each step measured, unsure of what the next hour would hold. Hazel looked up as he approached, but didn't rise. She didn't smile either. Though something in her expression had softened since they last spoke, she gestured for him to sit. He did, leaving a respectful space between them. For a while they said nothing. They simply watched Lily dart back and forth across the grass, chasing dandelion seeds and butterflies. Edward appreciated the silence. It felt honest. He knew no words could undo the years that had passed. "She likes dragons," Hazel said finally, her voice quiet but steady. "Not the scary ones. She says they protect people who don't have swords." Edward let out a soft breath, almost a laugh, but more like a release. "She told me that once, at the coffee shop." Hazel glanced at him. "I suppose she did. She doesn't usually talk to strangers, normally." "It surprised me too," he admitted. "But I'm glad she did." Hazel looked back at Lily, who had now started building a nest out of twigs and grass. "She's smart, observant, notices everything," Hazel said, her voice distant. "She knows something's different lately. She asked me last night who you were." Edward felt his chest tighten. "What did you tell her?" "I said you were someone I used to know, someone who might want to know her too." He nodded, swallowing hard. "That's true. I didn't tell her you were her father," Hazel added quickly. "Not yet. I'm not sure she's ready for that. And I'm not sure you are either." He didn't argue. She was right. Wanting something and being ready for it were two different things. "I don't want to hurt her," he said, his voice low. "Or you." Hazel finally turned to face him. Her eyes were clear but heavy, the kind of gaze that came from years of holding things together, unaided. "Then don't disappear again," she said. "Whatever you decide, make sure it's not temporary. She doesn't need anyone else walking in and out of her life." He nodded. "I won't. Not this time." That was the beginning. The weeks that followed passed with caution, but with consistency. Edward didn't try to barge into Lily's life. He asked permission for everything. If he could walk them home, if he could bring Lily a book or a small toy, if he could visit the gallery when Hazel had a new painting to show. Hazel appreciated his restraint, Trust was slowly rebuilding, brick by brick, word by word. Lily accepted him faster than Hazel did. She was endlessly curious, asking him questions about his favorite animals. If he could whistle, if he knew how to make pancakes. Sometimes she called him Edward. Sometimes, simply, that man. He didn't mind. He knew she was watching him, trying to figure him out in her own quiet way. Then, everything changed. It started one Wednesday afternoon. Hazel noticed Lily seemed more tired than usual after daycare. She refused dinner, wanted to go to bed early, and kept saying her legs hurt. Hazel assumed it was a growth spurt, or perhaps exhaustion from running around all day. But the next morning, Lily couldn't stand without crying. She was pale, warm to the touch, and lethargic, in a way that didn't feel normal. Hazel rushed her to the pediatric clinic. Tests were run. Blood was drawn. Doctors began to speak in hushed tones. And then the word came, one that drained all the color from Hazel's face. A rare, aggressive, but treatable autoimmune disease, requiring immediate medical intervention and a compatible blood donor for a plasma transfusion protocol. Hazel sat in the hospital hallway, her hands numb, her world spinning. Edward arrived an hour after her call. She had hesitated before calling him, but the fear in her chest was too heavy to carry alone. When he showed up, she saw something on his face she hadn't expected. Terror. Real fear. Human. Not for himself, but for the child lying in the hospital bed behind them. He asked no questions. He simply said, "What do I need to do?" Hazel gave him the short version. The treatment. The urgency. The donor compatibility. Before she could finish the sentence, he said, "Test me." He was a match. Not just a partial match, but an almost perfect one. The doctors were surprised. Hazel wasn't. Somewhere deep in her gut, despite the pain and everything that had happened, she knew fate was still watching them. The procedure was done the next day. Edward donated twice in 1 week. He barely rested, refusing hotel rooms and staying in the hospital family waiting room. He only left when Hazel coaxed him to shower or eat something. When Lily woke up, weak but smiling, the first thing she said was, "You're still here." Edward nodded. "I told you I would be." Hazel stood in the doorway of the hospital room, watching them. Her eyes burned with tears she hadn't shed in years. It wasn't just the fact that Edward had stayed. It was the way he looked at his daughter, with a mix of awe and protection that couldn't be faked. It was how Lily reached for his hand without hesitation. It was the quiet, steady presence he had become. Not loud, not showy, but reliable. That night, as the machine softly beeped and nurses changed shifts outside, Hazel sat beside Edward in the small hospital room, her fingers wrapped around a paper coffee cup. "I don't know who you were 3 years ago," she said quietly, "but I see who you are now." He looked at her, exhausted, eyes red-rimmed, and nodded. "Me neither. Until her." And Hazel, for the first time, didn't look away. The weeks following Lily's procedure unfolded in a haze of cautious hope. Her condition slowly stabilized, and the tension that had clung to Hazel's every breath began to ease. The hospital discharged her sooner than expected, with a strict schedule of follow-up visits and medications. But Hazel didn't complain. She carried Lily in her arms to the car Edward had rented, and when he offered to drive them home, she nodded without hesitation. There was no longer any question of whether he belonged there. He had proven it with every moment of quiet vigilance, every sleepless night by his daughter's bedside, every time he asked the doctors more questions than Hazel had the strength to think of. Once they were home, things didn't simply revert to how they'd been before. In fact, nothing had ever really been normal to begin with. Hazel found herself adjusting to a new kind of rhythm, one that now included Edward. He visited daily, never imposing, always asking before he crossed the threshold. At first, Lily would light up at the sight of him, running to show him her drawings or drag him towards a pile of picture books. Hazel kept her distance, watching carefully, waiting for the illusion to break. But it never did. Edward had changed, not in a grand, romanticized way, but in the subtle, meaningful ways that mattered. He started picking Lily up from daycare when Hazel had a gallery meeting or an extra shift at the diner. He cooked simple dinners, always asking what Lily liked first, and sat cross-legged on the floor while she insisted on brushing his hair with a plastic toy comb. He didn't try to force anything, didn't ask for titles or favors. He simply showed up, again and again, until Hazel stopped counting the times. One afternoon, after Lily had fallen asleep on the sofa surrounded by a nest of stuffed animals, Hazel was in the kitchen washing paint from her hands when she heard the soft sound of Edward humming. He was sitting beside his daughter, gently brushing a strand of hair from her cheek, his eyes soft with something far deeper than guilt or obligation. Hazel watched from the doorway, arms crossed, not out of defensiveness, but because her chest was too full to do anything else. That look, the quiet wonder on his face, wasn't the look of a man passing through. It was the look of someone who had been lost and had finally found the one thing that mattered. Later that night, when Lily was in bed and the apartment was quiet, save for the soft hum of the heater, Hazel handed Edward a mug of tea and sat beside him at the small kitchen table. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer a wall, but a bridge. Hazel looked at him then, truly looked at him. And she saw someone who had been stripped down to his core and rebuilt not by ambition or pride, but by love. "I don't think I ever hated you," she said suddenly, her voice low, almost fragile. "I was angry. I was hurt. But I never stopped wondering who you could have been. If only you had stayed." Edward's hand tightened around the mug. He didn't look at her immediately, fearing that even blinking might break the fragile honesty she had just offered him. "I hated myself," he said finally. "Every day, especially after I saw her, after I saw you. I think I just kept working so hard because it was easier to be successful than to admit I was a coward." Hazel nodded. Eyes wet but unblinking. "You were." He let out a small, sad laugh. "I know, but I want to do better. Not just be better, but do better. For her. For you, if you'll let me." Hazel looked at her hands, then back at him. "You're not the man I left. I see that. But I don't know what we are now." Edward leaned forward, his voice barely a whisper. "Then let's find out. Slowly. No promises. No pressure. Just the truth. All you can give me." She didn't answer him that night. But the next morning, when he knocked on the door and asked if Lily wanted to go feed the ducks at the park, Hazel handed him her coat and said, "We'll both go." That became their new normal. Walks in the park, lazy mornings with pancake batter smudged on noses, afternoons coloring at the kitchen table. They weren't a perfect family. Hazel didn't even call them that. But something about their closeness felt real. The past hadn't vanished, but it no longer defined them. They were something new, something slowly growing in the light that came after the storm. One weekend, Hazel took Edward to her art studio. It was a modest space above a bookshop, filled with natural light and the scent of turpentine. She hadn't shared it with anyone outside her close circle. It was hers, her sanctuary. She showed him her recent paintings, portraits of women, mothers, children, and let him linger in front of the ones she had never displayed, the ones she had painted in the quiet nights after Lily was born. One particular canvas stopped him cold. It was of a man, standing just outside a doorway, his face blurred by shadow, but his posture unmistakably tense, as if he wanted to come in, but didn't know if he was allowed. "I painted that the week after she was born," Hazel said softly from behind him. "I didn't know if I hated you or missed you, so I painted both." Edward stared at the piece for a long time, his throat tight. Then he turned and held out his hand to her, not with certainty, but with hope. Hazel didn't pull away, not this time. They stood in the light of the studio, surrounded by unfinished canvases and the scent of old paint, no longer trapped by who they had been, but beginning to understand who they might become. Summer arrived softly in Portland, and with it a warmth that went deeper than the skin. It settled into the quiet mornings, into the giggles echoing from Lily's room, into the soft music spilling from Hazel's studio window as she painted with the door open. For the first time in years, life didn't feel like survival. It felt like something whole, something earned. There were still scars, emotional ones, that occasionally throbbed in the background, but they no longer drove the story. And Edward, once a shadow lurking at the edges of Hazel's world, had now become part of its rhythm. Their days began to have a quiet synchronicity. Edward no longer asked if he could stop by. He just did, often showing up with coffee for Hazel and a box of sidewalk chalk for Lily, who had grown accustomed to decorating the pavement outside the building with dragons and castles and what she called a gummy bear kingdom. Weekends were spent exploring the city like tourists in their own hometown, visiting farmers' markets, taking short hikes, letting Lily ride the carousel on the waterfront over and over until she was dizzy with joy. The three of them moved together like a constellation that had slowly found its alignment. Hazel found herself softening in ways she hadn't expected. One night, after Lily had fallen asleep with her arms around a stuffed owl, Hazel and Edward sat on the fire escape, sharing a blanket and a bottle of red wine. They talked about everything they'd never said, their childhoods, their loneliness, what it had cost them both to live in separate silences for so long. It was the kind of conversation that healed more than it hurt. By the end, when Edward reached for her hand, she didn't hesitate. Their relationship was still new, still tender, like something growing through the cracks of old pavement. But it was real. Hazel no longer felt like she was giving something away by letting him in. She was reclaiming it, rebuilding it on her own terms. By late August, Hazel's art was getting more attention. Her work had been featured in a downtown gallery, and a collector from Seattle expressed interest in commissioning a series. Edward, now fully invested in her success, helped her set up a small online shop and organized a fundraiser to support local artists, naming Hazel as one of the featured guests. He didn't just want to help her, he wanted to see her thrive. And Hazel, in turn, began to trust him in ways that had once seemed impossible. There were still days the past brushed against her heart like a cold wind, reminding her of everything she'd done alone. But it no longer defined their future. Lily, too, blossomed. She had started calling Edward Daddy on her own, unprompted, one afternoon, when he helped her fix the wing of her favorite toy unicorn. Hazel had been in the next room, folding laundry. When she heard it, the word made her freeze. For a second, she waited for the sting of old pain to return. But it didn't. Instead, she smiled. That September, on the last night of Hazel's solo exhibition, the space buzzed with soft music, laughter, and the clinking of wine glasses. Hazel stood in the center of the room, wearing a pale blue dress splattered with paint near the hem, looking radiant as only someone fulfilled can look. Lily ran through the exhibition with her tiny camera, pretending to be a photographer, while Edward stayed close but out of her spotlight, proud and observant, content to let Hazel shine. Near the end of the night, when most of the guests had left and the lights had dimmed, Edward asked Hazel to step outside with him. The air was cool and quiet. The streets were emptying as the city wound down. They walked slowly, hand in hand, until they reached a small public square ringed with string lights and benches. Edward stopped, turning to face her. His heart pounded, not from nerves, but from something heavier. Conviction. Hazel looked at him, sensing the shift in his posture. "I used to think love was secondary to ambition," he said quietly. "I believed I had to prove my worth through achievement, through status, through being in control all the time. But when I lost you, when I saw Lily for the first time, everything changed. It wasn't just about regret. It was about realizing I'd been measuring my worth by the wrong ruler." Hazel's breath hitched, but she didn't interrupt. "I didn't deserve you back then," he continued. "Perhaps I still don't, but I love you. I love her, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving I've changed, not with words, but with how I show up every single day." From his coat pocket, he pulled a small, simple velvet box. No grand gestures, no rehearsed speeches, just the truth. He opened it. Inside was a ring, elegant, understated, a silver band with a single green stone that matched the color of her eyes. He didn't get down on one knee. That had never been his style. Instead, he held the ring between them, his voice soft. "When I asked you to choose between Lily and me, you walked away without hesitation. That was the bravest thing anyone has ever done to me. But now I'm not asking you to choose. I'm asking if you'll let me stand beside you. You and her. Forever. No conditions. Just love." Hazel didn't cry. Instead, she smiled through the emotion that swelled in her chest and reached out, gently placing her hand over his heart. "You always wanted to negotiate," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But this isn't a deal. This is a gift. And yes, the answer is yes." He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Later, when they returned to the gallery to pick up Lily, she ran towards them with a drawing in her hand. A sketch of 3 stick figures holding hands under a giant smiling sun. Above their heads, in crooked but determined letters, she had written, "My family." Hazel folded the paper and tucked it into her bag like something priceless. Because it was. Thank you for reading. We hope this story resonated with you. If it did, please give it a thumbs up, share it with a friend, and don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring narratives. Your comments and feedback are always welcome.